Hi everyone, and welcome to Pour One Out for A11y, the 4 principles of WCAG. I had issues with Hopin this year during Code PaLOusa, and thus was sadly not able to stream this talk. However, I wanted to make sure to do this recording so that I could make sure that you all still got to see this topic. As well as, I will have contact information at the end of this presentation so that you can contact me with questions, and I also have a GitHub repository where you can get copies of these slides. And with that, let's begin. First, even though we're not at Code PaLOusa physically right now, I still want to give a shout out to the Code PaLOusa sponsors, because without them, Code PaLOusa just wouldn't be possible. We wouldn't have the space, we wouldn't have Hopin, or any of that. So gotta give a shout out to them. Now, who am I? And why am I here jabbering about this? Well, my name is Arissa Duval. I currently work as an accessibility engineer with CVS, as well as part-time do QA work for Good Maps. In the past, I've also worked with the American Printing House for the Blind in Louisville, Kentucky. And it was at the Printing House for the Blind that I really kind of got thrown into the deep end on accessibility. Prior to starting there, I thought I knew what accessibility really meant. And boy, was I wrong. I, like many others, immediately assumed that it was more directed at medical conditions, or people with more visual disability needs, such as someone with a seeing eye dog, a person with a cane, a person in a wheelchair, or someone with a missing limb. But there, I learned that it actually went quite a bit further than that, and in fact, I kind of learned to understand myself and my own accessibility needs that I'd been taught to sort of ignore when I was younger. And with that, I learned just how important awareness of accessibility was, and so I want to share what I learned in order to help hopefully bring a little bit more awareness to everyone else, so that we can all make this world a much more accessible, friendly place. Now, I've been saying accessibility, but you may have noticed that in the title to this talk, I used the word A11y. What is that? Well, A11y is a numeronym that stands for the word accessibility. And what is a numeronym, you might ask? Well, a numeronym is probably something you've actually seen more often than you realize. A numeronym is just when you replace some of the letters in the word with numbers. The end result may be just representative of the original word, may sound like the original word still, or just look kind of like the original word. In the case of A11y, it stands for the fact that the word accessibility begins with an A, ends with a Y, and has 11 characters in between. Now, A11y is typically used for digital accessibility versus physical accessibility in, say, like a workplace, how it's laid out. It's more used for web content, digital content, things of that nature. Now, how do we define accessibility? Well, originally, a lot of people were like I used to be. They instantly assumed medical conditions were all that really qualified for accessibility. But that's not the case anymore. Now we notice that there's actually a much broader way that accessibility can be applied, and thus a lot of organizations have switched to a more social model of accessibility, which looks at the fact that there are multiple instances throughout any given day in which you may face a mismatch in how you're able to interact with the environment around you that may be temporary, situational, or permanent. And thus, a lot of places have started using a definition for accessibility that closely matches what Microsoft uses in their Accessibility Fundamentals course, and that is, accessibility is a word used to describe whether a product can be used by people of all abilities. They've also switched to a different definition of disability that's not as medically focused, and such as Microsoft's definition that a disability is a mismatch in interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of the environment in which they live. So, what would be some different examples of this? Well, imagine a parent carrying their child around. While they're carrying their child around, they have impaired mobility of their arms. They're not necessarily going to be able to interact with parts of their environment that require the use of their arms the same way that they would if they were not carrying the child and instead allowing them to run free and destroy their house. Similarly, someone who has a broken arm is also going to not be able to interact with the world around them in the same way, albeit most likely temporary in that case versus situational. Or someone could become an amputee and lose one of their arms and thus permanently have a change in how they interact with their environment around them. Another good example would be a construction worker at a construction site. While the heavy machinery isn't running at the construction site, construction workers can more freely communicate verbally between each other. However, once that equipment gets turned on, they have to use hearing coverage to protect their hearing, and thus they're not able to verbally communicate as easily, and thus require the use of flags, hand signals, and different colored clothing and signs to help communicate the actions that they need their colleagues around them to take, or to give warnings. Now, how do we deal with these mismatches? Well, assistive technology. For instance, a parent who has a child may instead have one of those chest straps that allows them to temporarily carry the child in front of them like that, freeing up their arms. A construction worker, again, they have those flags such that they can use and signage to help them communicate with each other. If someone becomes an amputee, for instance, the picture that's on this slide is of a runner with a amputated leg and a prosthetic leg that allows him to still run in races. That is assistive technology. Additionally, assistive technology can be things such as a refreshable braille display, a screen reader, a puff and sip machine, eye tracking technology, and more. Assistive technology goes way further than we necessarily would imagine it. Even your eyeglasses, if you have to wear those even temporarily, that's assistive technology because it helps to lessen or eliminate that mismatch between you and your environment around you. Now, with that, how do we define what makes something accessible? Well, for the physical within the US, like the way that a building is laid out, workplace policies, you'll often hear of the ADA or the Americans with Disability Act. That's an actual legal regulation, though. Additionally, there are guidelines, many of which are actually used to define legal regulations, like ADA. One of these that's very well known is WCAG. WCAG stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These were defined by the Web Accessibility Initiative of the World Wide Web Consortium, which is often shortened to W3C, which you've probably heard of more than just the full name written out. The W3C, and in particular their Web Accessibility Initiative, are also responsible for a lot of other accessibility-related technical specifications and guidelines. Some of these include the well-known ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and is a technical specification created by the WAI. Additionally, some other guidelines that are similar to WCAG include the UAG, which stands for User Agent Accessibility Guidelines, and the ATAG, which stands for Authoring Tools Accessibility Guidelines. WCAG, UAG, and ATAG in particular really build upon one another, with WCAG handling the content that a user may ingest from a digital platform, such as a Word document, the content on a web page, a PDF, or the content within a mobile application. ATAG is going to deal more with the tools that are used to create that content. So for instance, Visual Studio Code, Microsoft Word, Adobe Acrobat, or other content creation programs. WCAG, on the other hand, is going to deal more with how is the user accessing that content. That could be a browser such as Chrome, Edge, or Firefox, or it could be Adobe Reader or Microsoft Word, since you use Microsoft Word typically to view a Word document that you're reading. And that's why all of these kind of build upon one another and have a lot of overlap between them. But today we're going to focus primarily on WCAG and POUR. What is POUR? And what does it have to do with the WCAG? Well, POUR is the 4 core principles that make up the WCAG. POUR stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. WCAG uses the POUR principles kind of like categories to divide up the guidelines into groups and help define kind of what each of those sets of guidelines is trying to accomplish in terms of improving accessibility. In WCAG 2.1, there are 13 guidelines that are divided up amongst these 4 principles. This number may change as we move into WCAG 2.2 by the end of 2022, and as we move into WCAG 3.0 sometime within the next couple of years. However, right now, for the sake of this, we're focusing on 2.1, which is the current main version of WCAG. Within 2.1, there are 13 guidelines. These 13 guidelines are then further defined using sets of success criterion. These success criterion are categorized as being either A, AA, or AAA conformance. I bring up the conformance levels because a lot of times people see AAA and they think, oh, I must meet AAA. I mean, think of a video game. Everybody who makes video games wants to be the one to make a new successful AAA video game. But AAA isn't necessarily what you need to shoot for in WCAG. And in fact, within the WCAG guidelines, they even say that you really, most of the time, aren't going to be able to meet full AAA conformance. You're not even necessarily going to 100% need to meet AA, because some of the AA criteria just won't apply to your content. For instance, if you have content that doesn't have audio, video, or audio and video that are synced up, or live content, guidelines that deal with those kinds of content aren't going to apply to your content, and thus you're not going to have to meet them. So there's just not really a way for you to meet them. Similarly, if you don't have content that flashes, you're not going to need to worry about the guidelines that relate to flashing or strobing content. There may be other times when you meet criteria in a slightly different way based on the audience of your content. You may have part of your content that is meant more for users who are using screen readers, and so you're going to really focus in on the criteria that create the best experience for a screen reader user, and maybe have an alternate form that is meant for your visual users. It's all kind of a customizable sort of thing. This is also kind of where VPATs and reports like that will come into play, because they're going to help to further define like how you're being conformant, where you fall out of conformancy, and how you're either trying to become conformant or why you can't meet those conformancy guidelines. Now, you can't just say, I can't meet these guidelines. There needs to be a valid justification. But that's not for this talk. Now, the first of the core principles is perceivable. Perceivable is defined by the WCAG as information and user interface components must be presentable to users in a way that they can perceive. Basically, what this means is they need to be able to tell that the content is there and tell that it's meaningful, that it's content that's meant for them to be able to ingest, to take in. This is where text alternatives, for instance, which is Guideline 1.1, comes into play. Guideline 1.1 text alternative handles things such as alt text. And with alt text, you're going to be letting the user know, first off, is this decorative or informative content? And you're going to be helping them to understand what that content is. This is also providing alternatives such as print, large print, braille, speech, and such to users who may need that kind of a way to take in the content. This is also making sure that if you have content that has time limits and such, that you give alternatives for users who maybe can't take it in. This can be things like transcripts, captioning, things of that nature. And it's all broken down further as you get into like the success criteria. If you want to learn more about those success criteria, I really highly recommend checking out the WCAG online, because some of them get really interesting in how you can, different ways that you can meet some of these guidelines. Next, we're going to look at operable. Operable means that user interface components and navigation must be operable. Two of the really big ones here are keyboard accessible. And why is keyboard accessible important? Well, if you can make content keyboard accessible, you'll hear that focused on a lot for users who are using a screen reader, but really if you make it keyboard accessible, think of if a user messes up one of their hands and can't as easily operate the mouse. If they can still operate it with a keyboard, they can still make use of the site. Additionally, if they're using other assistive technologies such as the puff and sip one that I mentioned earlier, or eye tracking technologies, a lot of times if you make it keyboard accessible, since those are kind of using a similar sort of tabbing and whatnot to navigate, you'll still make it accessible for those technologies as well. This also involves making sure you provide enough time. So using like the countdown, you want to make sure that you're giving users enough time to provide whatever input they need to provide, that they can reasonably do so before time runs out. Seizures. We've seen what happens sometimes when seizures are not taken into account, and it can be quite disastrous. And hopefully none of us are wanting to cause harm like that. If you are, might want to reconsider that one. That's a little worrisome. Again, and also this is also dealing with making sure that the site is navigable. You want to try to use logical reading orders and making sure that your content is organized in such a way that it makes sense as the user is going through it. Or like tab order, making sure that the tab order makes sense and that when they tab through it, keyboard focus doesn't randomly go all the way to the bottom of the page and then back up to the top. Things of this nature are important to think of when we're trying to make content operable to a wider array of users. Next, we have understandable. And this one might kind of include some things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. You want to make sure that your text and your content is readable and understandable. For instance, if I have a book like Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, and you're expecting an English book, and instead you see that recognizable cover, but then you notice that the text doesn't look like English. You're not going to be able to read through that book. You may know what the general story of it is. You may be able to take in some context from the images in the book, but the content's not going to be readable to you. This can also happen if you don't provide the correct language tags for your page, as well as to individual content in the page that may switch to a different language. When a screen reader is reading through a page, it determines how to pronounce words in part through those language tags. So for instance, if you set the page to English, but then you have a section of the text that's in French, and you don't put a different language tag on that French content to indicate that it's French, it may not get pronounced correctly, and thus could lead to misunderstandings and also lead to the user not being informed that that content is in a different language. Another good example of this is, say you're creating a website for elementary school students, first graders, first grade math website, in fact. But they get to it and all the content is college level wording, all the math problems are advanced calculus. That's gonna probably be a very overwhelming and just confusing sort of scenario for those kids to walk into. It wouldn't be any different than if you walked into a Sociology 100 class and the teacher suddenly was covering things that were actually intended for a master's level sociology class. You're going to be incredibly lost because the content is not properly designed for what you would reasonably be expected to understand or would reasonably expect to find in that class. So that's why it's so important to make sure that content is understandable. Another good way to think about this is, let's say you have a user who they are looking for information on how to contact poison control because their child just ate something and they're not quite sure if it's something that they need to be concerned about or not. So they want to reach out and find out. If I go to that website, I'm going to be in a bit of a hectic mindset, panicky. So I want content to be predictable, to make sense, and to be in what places that I expect it to be, and to be in a context that makes sense to me, especially in that kind of a situation. These are different ways that you can help make your content more understandable. And then finally, we have robust. Robust has one guideline. It's very nice and simple. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. Think of when you pull up a website and you pull it up in Firefox, but it looks off. So instead you open it up in Chrome and it looks better, or it's different at least. The same thing happens with screen readers. When screen reader users open up a site, the type of screen reader they're using can really impact what HTML elements they're compatible with, what ARIA they're compatible with. For instance, just not too long ago, there was new ARIA attributes released. Well, because it's so new, not all of the screen readers have full compatibility with that yet. So if you were already using all those new ARIA attributes, you could be unintentionally blocking out some of your users who are using NVDA, narrator, voiceover, or other user agents even, because not all browsers even are going to interact with that ARIA the same way. This is why it's important to test with multiple different browsers, to test with multiple different screen readers. It's okay if you want to say, we have seen the best performance with this browser and this screen reader combination. But don't expect that that's going to be the same combination that all users are going to have, and don't make it the responsibility of the user to have to switch to that particular combination just to make use of your site. Imagine if you're navigating through your banking app, your social media sites, and with each one you had to switch to a different browser in order to have a usable experience. You would get annoyed pretty quick. And that's where this robust comes in. It's important that we maximize the compatibility of our content with different versions of screen readers, browsers, and such, in order to provide a good, accessible experience for our users. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to support IBM mainframe, or you have to support IE version 2. There is a level of reasonableness to it. Typically, a lot of places will look at what's the most recently supported by the manufacturer. So for instance, right now, Windows doesn't support IE anymore. So you're going to start to see a lot of IE support drop off for a lot of sites steadily. They may maintain it temporarily, but because they can't download IE anymore, they can't as easily test in it, so it's just going to be a little less reasonable for them to maintain support for IE in the coming years. Now, why should you care about this? Why should you want to learn about it? And how can you work to improve accessibility? And my favorite, why not just automate it? Why can't I just run an automated test and be like, oh, okay, my content's accessible? I actually have a good example for that one here in just a little bit. But first off, learning about accessibility helps everyone to make informed decisions that can benefit themselves and those around them the most. And also, a lot of accessibility actually benefits everyone just in general. This is a concept that's often referred to as the curb cut effect. It's the idea that you make technology geared towards one group, and you actually end up benefiting a much more diverse group of people than you really thought about. This comes from the fact that way on back, during either World War I or World War II, I cannot remember right off, there was one town out west in the US that started doing curb cuts. Some little divots that you'll see in the curb to usually indicate where a sidewalk is, or a place where you can safely step up onto the curb a lot easier. These were originally made for returning vets who were coming back and maybe had mobility impairments that made it more difficult for them to navigate around their hometown to shop, to work, and whatnot. But nowadays, you see those as just standard everywhere, not even just within the US, but worldwide, because of the strong benefit that they provide to everyone, whether it's someone pulling luggage around, a student walking to school, or a parent with a child pushing a stroller. Now we see that it benefits everyone, and accessibility in general really is beneficial to everyone. If nothing else, you're helping to allow people to take a more active role in their everyday life, to have a more fulfilled life. And this is especially important because true accessibility means including everybody. It means being inclusive. This is why you're seeing a lot of companies now take the approach of putting accessibility and DEI together, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because to have true diversity, equity, and inclusion, you have to include accessibility. And to have true accessibility, you have to include DEI. Now, the ways that you can help with this is take an accessibility first approach. Don't wait until your product is supposedly ready for production and then go, oh wait, we haven't done any accessibility design testing. We haven't done any accessibility testing at all. Because it's going to be a lot harder. It's always easy to be proactive rather than reactive. Additionally, be an ally. If you see something that you think might be an accessibility issue, bring it up. Include individuals from a diverse set of backgrounds and with a diverse array of ability in from the beginning, so that maybe they'll notice something that you just weren't aware was a possible issue. And speak up, because they might not realize that there's an issue. If a screen reader user isn't able to see any of the images on a site because they've all been given a null attribute, they're not necessarily going to realize that they're missing that. So sometimes it's okay to speak up, be that ally, and help. But of course, including them from the beginning is going to help increase your chances of catching those issues before they make it to production. And a moment ago, I said, why not just automate it? You cannot 100% automate accessibility conformance. You can't do it with an accessibility overlay, so don't let those ones fool you. Those are band-aids that just cover up or sometimes make worse accessibility issues rather than actually fixing them. And they don't make stuff WCAG conformant. Additionally, automation isn't necessarily going to pick out all the little nuances. For instance, I mentioned the images all having null attributes. Well, automation isn't going to necessarily be able to recognize whether a image is something that is meaningful, that needs an alt attribute, or whether it's decorative. So it's just gonna see, oh, there's an alt attribute on everything. Okay, you're good. When in reality, you're far from it. So now, in order to show that, I have a demo. So here I have a good site example, and then I have a bad site example. They're not pretty, but you'll notice they look almost exactly the same, with the exception of having a slightly different title at the beginning. Now, if I go to the good site and I run Accessibility Insights here, which I do want to add, Accessibility Insights is an amazing free tool that is open source from Microsoft, and it actually has an automated portion, and it has a really wonderful manual guided process where you can go through and manually test for things as well to make sure you're catching everything. Now, if I run the FastPass, which is the automated check, you'll notice that I get 0 out of 0 failed instances. Awesome. I'm good, right? Now, if I go to the bad side example and I similarly run FastPass, wait, I also get 0. But then why is this bad? How can this be bad? It looks the same as the good site, and if I was visually just looking through this site, I could navigate either one the same way. I could recognize the different styling for the links and be like, oh, okay, those are links, that's probably navigation since they're together. I could see the slightly bold and larger text of the headers and immediately pick out the different sections a little bit more easily within this. I can see the images and I can identify generally what they kind of look like they are. And I can do the same thing on the bad one for me. No big deal, right? Not so. I'm going to go into the code now, the markup behind the scenes. And on the good example, you'll notice I have my doc type, my opening HTML tag. I have an English, so I'm assuming the page is primarily in English. And then I have my head, and then in my body, I have it broken up into a nice header section with a nav element. I have a main section that is broken down into other subsections. I have header elements that are in hierarchical order going H1, H2, H3. Awesome. I have a footer that also has a nav section in it. It's all nice and good, right? Minus, I will say, the one little mistake I made on this is technically that little title that's up here at the top of the page should be the H1, and then all of these should be H2, 3, 4 going down. You can technically have more than one H1 element on a page as long as things are in hierarchical order, but best practices is that your top, kind of your title, should be the H1, and then subsequent headers should go in hierarchical order going 2, 3, 4, and so on. And you should always follow hierarchical order. You should never have it go H2 to H4 to H3. It should go 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, like that, so that they're properly nested. But we'll just ignore that for today on here. Just the fact that I don't have that main H1 tag. On the bad example, though, you'll notice I have a different language tag, which, I don't know, this randomly generated text looks more Latin-y to me, but okay. But then you'll notice that when we get into the body of this one is where it really gets funky. I don't have any, it's all divs. I have one div that has a role of navigation, but otherwise, the rest of these are just kind of all over the place. There's no footer, there's no nav elements around my navigation links. There's nothing to tell me where my main content is necessarily and where the header is. It's kind of a mess. Now, how would this impact things, especially, and make it inaccessible? I mean, because it still looks the same, right? Well, the problem comes in when you're using certain assistive technologies. A lot of them will do something similar to what screen readers do. With a screen reader, a user could go to this site, and if it was set up like the good one with all the proper headers, they can actually open up what's called an elements list, which will break down the elements on the page based on whether they're links, headers, form elements, or landmarks. Landmarks being things like the header, the main, the footer, and there's other sections that you can potentially use in addition to that. It allows them to look for those. And in a way, if you think about it, that's the same as me visually just looking at this site and being able to immediately hone in on where links are, where headers are, where images are, and things of that sort. If there was a form on this page, as long as it was formatted properly, I would be able to probably quickly pick out that, oh hey, there's the form, that's what I need to fill out. Especially if there was a proper header or title for it. And that would be awesome. And on the good page, it would work. Just like that. No problem. The bad site, though, they'd get the links, but if they pulled up the headers, there wouldn't be any listed because there's not actually any header elements for the screen reader to be able to pick up on and recognize they're there. Instead, they'd be having to potentially go through line by line, character by character, trying to figure out where the different sections of the page were and hopefully being able to identify them, and missing out on all the images since none of the images, as you can see here, have an actual alt value. They just have a null little empty string for their alt attribute. So they're not gonna, in fact, a screen reader, if it gets to an image that has a null attribute like that, it just skips it because it thinks, oh, it's just decorative. Or if it is informative, that information must be presented somewhere else on the page, surely. Because surely the people wouldn't just put an empty alt attribute on there for the fun of it. I mean, honestly, at this point, if these are all informative images, you'd honestly be better off just not putting an alt attribute on there, but that's not good practice. Especially because you could have, like here, you'll notice my image names seem to be fairly distinctive, and that's what would be read off if there was no alt attribute whatsoever. But say all your images are hashes or randomly generated names. Maybe you pulled an image off your phone and it just gave it like a random prefix and then like a number hash at the end of it that's like the date that it was taken and other information. That's not going to be distinguishable. It's not going to help identify what that image is. And that's why that alt attribute is so important. So as you can see, you could automate testing, but you don't need to depend on it, because if you depend on it, you're going to miss all these issues on the back end that otherwise you could pick up by manual testing. Okay. I have a QA section in here, but obviously since this is a recording, you can't necessarily ask me questions. However, if you want, you can go to my homepage at corgidev.com. I am also on Twitter and Twitch under the corgidev. Twitter I'm actually very responsive on. I also have an email on my homepage for you to check out if you want. Additionally, I am on LinkedIn and Instagram and GitHub under corgidev. I also have a YouTube channel, which I'll upload this to eventually, once I've given the Code PaLOusa people first dibs. So you are free to check it out on YouTube once it gets put up there and to comment on it, and I will do my very best to answer any questions you may have. And regardless, I thank you for taking the time to watch this today, and I really hope that I gave you a lot to think about, or a lot of stuff that you want to learn about, that I would be more than happy to help with. Thank you, and goodbye.